Okay, so what does this mean to what we're talking about now? We're talking about a long time ago, we're talking about Europe. What does this mean as far as structural racism in the United States goes? Well, white supremacy, in order for it to continue, it has myths. It has stories that it tells that, that perpetuate it. All right, and these have to do with different stereotypes. And these stories, these stereotypes are very prevalent in the slavery era, they're really prevalent in the Reconstruction era, they're prevalent in Jim Crow, all right? And they're still with us today, they're just more subtle, okay? And so I want to address a myth of white supremacy. I want to be very clear, all right? I'm calling it a myth, and it's a myth that's perpetuated by white supremacy. I'm not in the slightest saying this is true. It's absurd, but in order to understand what we're talking about, we have to understand this. So one of the main myths of white supremacy is that white people are more driven by rational decisions, by intelligence, and so forth, whereas people of color are more driven by emotion and by passion. Okay? And so we see this in, in all sorts of stuff. Certainly, narratives of history are absolutely full of it, as far as, certainly eugenics research goes, but even just in the way that people talk about the relationship between black people and white people during slavery, like I said, Jim Crow, et cetera, et cetera. All right? But we see it today, it's still very prevalent today. All right, so when we see situations where people talk about a country that doesn't have democracy, all right, and we ask the question, are they ready for democracy? All right, so, when the United States is at war in Iraq or Afghanistan, there are people on, on talk shows, on mainstream media who are like, are they, I don't know, are they ready for democracy? Are they capable of governing themselves? All right, this goes back to these old stereotypes of white supremacy, all right? We don't look back and question, did Thomas Jefferson, was he capable of governing himself when he wrote the Declaration of Independence? Of course not. Nobody asked that question. Were the French capable of governing themselves when they had the French Revolution, et cetera, et cetera? Nobody questions that at all, all right? But when it's people of color who are doing it, well, I don't know, are they capable of democracy? We can think of examples in history of countries that had elections that, we didn't agree with, and all of a sudden, that government's overthrown or whatever. It can be in a much smaller sense, all right? An example I like to use all the time, sportscasters, all right? There was just a lot of talk about this in England with the way that sportscasters talk about soccer players, and how when they are commenting on a white soccer player about how he has such great vision and he sees the field and he knows what the plan is for the team, whereas when they talk about a black player, they talk about his physicality, his strength, so on and so forth. All right, and I've been saying the same thing for years about quarterbacks, for example, in football. The way that a black quarterback is talked about, it's always about his physicality, his strength, his speed, so on and so forth. The quarterback is supposed to be running things out there, right? They are, executing a plan, often calling the plan on the field and stuff like that. When white quarterbacks are discussed, they talk about their knowledge, their leadership, their vision for the field, and so on and so forth. It's rational versus passionate, physical, so on and so forth. Okay, and we can look at all sorts of situations where, to go back to that idea of double consciousness that I talked about in a previous lecture, where Muhammad Ali in 1967 says he's not going to go for the draft, and people abandon him. When LeBron James in 2010 leaves the Cavs to go play for the Miami Heat because Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh are going there too, and they're going to win 2 championships in a row, the next year, people are angry. They don't, because there's some expectation that black public figures will show some sort of humility. All right, people are mad. People used to be so mad that Cam Newton would celebrate when he did something on the field, because somehow he didn't know his place. All right, this is all just part of this sort of narrative. All right, and I'm not saying people are doing it intentionally. I'm not saying people are trying to be racist or anything like that. I'm just saying that there are these elements, these threads of white supremacy that run through our society, and we don't even think about it. That's why it's so dangerous. All right, here's where it gets really dangerous, because what we're talking about here, right? We're talking about structural racism. We're talking about, things like George Floyd, right? So two dangerous stereotypes that tend to happen a lot when in America talking about black people. One has to do with a sexual narrative, the idea that black people are especially sexual. And so in many of the lynchings, we talked about lynchings in a previous lecture, many of the lynchings, the example for why somebody was lynched was usually because they made some sort of sexual advance towards a white woman. This is a black man making an advance towards a white woman, or an accusation of rape, and things like that. Emmett Till was lynched because a white woman said that she made advances towards him. When in reality, a lot of people were lynched because they were a business competitor, because they were getting sort of too big. They didn't know their place. They weren't keeping humble. All right. In the 1980s, we see this target of the quote-unquote welfare mother, and this sort of hypersexualized image of black women having a bunch of kids because that somehow was going to get them more welfare benefits. And anyway, we'll talk about that era when we get to it. Okay, but what I really want to talk about is I want to talk about the other stereotype, and that has to do with violence, all right, and with physical strength. Because, all right, there's an assumption that black men are especially violent, especially prone to violence, especially strong, so on and so forth. Okay, so if this assumption is in somebody's head, all right, and so a white person's walking down the street and there's a black person coming at them down the street, and they cross the street because they're like, oh, I might get mugged, all right, that has a huge psychological effect on the person who's walking towards you, all right, towards the white person. If that keeps happening all day long, for their whole life, all right, but think about this, all right, think about this, all right. Now, this, again, the reason these ideas are so insidious is because we're unaware of them. And so these biases that are stuck in our heads, we don't know what's going on, all right? But when we think of police officers, all right, police officers go into a situation, all right, and the level of what they perceive somebody's potential level of violence, all right, has a huge effect on that, all right? So if all of us inside of us have some idea, all right, some bias that black people are more prone to violence or better at violence or something like that than white people, then when a white police officer goes into a situation where they're up against a black person, all right, they are going to be more afraid, all right? They are more likely to use violence in response, okay? Let's look at 4 examples, all right? Tamir Rice, Cleveland, Ohio, 2015, all right? He's a 12-year-old kid. He was playing in a park. He had a toy gun, like a lot of kids have, like I had when I was a kid. It's black. And somebody called the police, said, there's a kid walking around with a gun or something like that. You can see the video. It's hard to watch, but it's impossible for us not to know this stuff. The police car pulls up and it immediately fires. immediately fires, killing him. All right. We look at Breonna Taylor. Breonna Taylor was killed this year in Louisville, Kentucky. The police were trying to execute an arrest warrant. They thought that the person they were trying to arrest was at her house. It's a no-knock warrant, so they didn't announce themselves. They just busted open the door, fired, and killed her. She was in bed. As if you know the story, the guy they were trying to arrest was already in custody. It's a horrific story. All right, Breonna Taylor, also black. The guy they were trying to arrest, also black. This expectation of this extra level of violence, the police act immediately with violence. Okay, look at these guys. Dylan Roof. All right, Charleston, South Carolina, 2015. Dylan Roof, white guy, goes into a church, the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, very historic black church in Charleston, South Carolina. The kid's a white supremacist. He sort of befriends or acts like he's friendly with the people in there. He kills 9 people, shoots them, people who were there to pray, and he's arrested without violence. Right? Very, very famously, after he kills 9 people, the cops bring him to Burger King on the way back to the police station. All right, look at James Holmes. James Holmes, all right, this is the guy who went to that 3rd Batman movie, and in 2012 in Aurora, Colorado, he killed 12 people and he injured 70 more people. The police arrested him without banging him up at all. Obviously, these are just 4 examples. They're extreme examples. But the point I'm trying to make here is that these stories that white supremacy tried to tell, all right, back when people were less nervous about appearing racist, these stories are still with us, and they exist throughout society. All right. In a half-hour lecture, it's hard for me to get into all of it. But the point is that because this stuff exists, we have to understand it. We have to find these biases in ourselves, and we have to kind of work through it somehow. All right. So that police aren't showing up and immediately shooting a 12-year-old kid with a toy gun, when there was a 12-year-old kid with a toy gun all over America. Right. Kids play with that stuff all the time. All right. Now, I said I was going to talk about this, and I do just want to sort of get to it. All right, I want to talk about nonviolent protest because we're going to be looking at the civil rights movement in the next 2 videos. And I know this is going on a little long. I appreciate you hanging in there. All right, I want to talk about nonviolent protest. And in order to sort of understand nonviolent protest, all right, the guy that we tend to go to is Mohandas Gandhi, all right, who honed his skills for 30 years in South Africa, winning a lot of civil rights for South Asian South Africans before he ever went back to India and won India's independence through nonviolent protest. All right, but Gandhi's sort of like the gold standard of how do you do nonviolence and what's the purpose of nonviolence. All right, many of us know that Martin Luther King Jr., when he was in graduate school, he traveled to India, to Madurai, to the museum made for Gandhi. He was so inspired by Gandhi's message and stuff. He read a lot. He took a lot from Gandhi. All right. In fact, in the famous 1963 "I Have a Dream" speech, he actually refers to Gandhi. We'll talk more about that later. Okay. So nonviolent protest is the type of protest that's used during the civil rights movement, and it's used because it works. It's used because it exposes these things that I've been talking about today. Okay? So when in 1963, a bunch of black people walked down the street in Birmingham, Alabama, all right? They're just walking down the street singing songs, all right? When Bull Connor and the police show up and they've got water cannons and they're turning dogs on teenage kids walking down the street, arresting them, hitting them with batons, tear gas, and so on and so forth. All right, it sends a couple really important messages. All right, now the first one is this: a lot of times people try to come up with other reasons other than racism as to why bad stuff is going on for people of color. All right, it's that cognitive dissonance. It's hard to admit that part of my comfort, part of what I have going on in my life that's so easy, I don't want to have to think about the fact that other people are suffering, and maybe I have a part in that. Okay, it's way easier to come up with other reasons why that might be happening. And so a lot of times people say, well, you know, there must be some other reason why black people are poorer than white people. All right, and you know, whatever, there's a bunch of reasons that people come up with. I'm not going to list them here because that's not the purpose of what I'm trying to do. The point is that if your argument is that black people are poor or don't have as good jobs because they're not as smart, because they're somehow inferior to white people, all right, that white people are just smarter, or it's easier to postpone gratification, or whatever idea that that you have that fits that white supremacy narrative. I'm not saying that you're doing it on purpose, all right? But if that's what you're saying, and then you see that people are just trying to walk down the street and the police or the townspeople show up and they attack them, all right? It demonstrates very clearly, all right, that it's not just somebody's inferiority that's keeping them back, but that they can't even walk down the street without being beaten, all right? That either the police get angry or the townspeople get angry and they're attacking them, all right? And it's a lot harder to believe that it's just the inferiority of black people that's holding them back when a bunch of white people show up and act violent towards them. All right, now, in keeping with that, the second point that I want to make, all right, and it's the last point I'm going to make, is that remember this idea, all right, this myth that white people are rational and intellectual, that people of color are passionate and emotional, all right? I want you to put yourself in the position, all right? Imagine it's 1960, all right, and you and three other people, you got to be black in this scenario, all right? You're sitting at the counter at Woolworths, you just want to order a cheeseburger. You know you're not allowed to because it's segregated, all right? Greensboro, North Carolina, Woolworths, you're sitting at that counter, all right? And you just want a menu. You just want to order, all right? And people show up and they're calling you horrible names, they're spitting at you, they're pouring sugar on your head, all right? Throwing stuff at you, all right? They're pushing you, all right, to try to get you to fight them. And you don't fight them, all right? You just sit there, all right? You just look forward and say, I'd like to order some food, please. And people are hitting you, all right? They're screaming at you and they're getting more and more. And so day after day goes on, you keep coming back, more people show up, there's a riot outside, right? Look at things like, you know, the desegregation of schools. Things like that. You have adults who are literally attacking small children who are trying to get an education, all right? In that situation, all right, we see very clearly that this myth that somehow white people have a better ability to be rational, to postpone gratification, what they want, all right, to put in the hard work to eventually get to some goal, all right? Well, I want you to imagine how hard it is to have somebody spit in your face, all right? Somebody push you, hit you, and not hit them back, all right? It's harder than you think, all right? And it also shows that white people are just as capable of being caught up by emotion, by being driven, by passion, by anger, and so on and so forth. All right? And so when a nonviolent protest happens, when the media is there to cover it so that there's proof of it, there's no sense in getting beaten up if nobody's going to know? All right. Although people in China have been doing it for years, unfortunately, they're trying to get that message out. Anyway, when the cameras are rolling and you see people walking down the street, afraid maybe, but super brave, very rational, all right, keeping that look on their face, I'm not going to fight you back, I'm not going to take the bait, and you see all these white people who are angry, who are cussing, who are shouting at people, hitting people, being violent and stuff like that, all right, that myth flies out the window. All right, who's rational, who's passionate? Okay, so in the next couple of lectures, we're going to talk about the civil rights movement. We're going to talk about some of these nonviolent protests, and we're going to talk about the violent response. Okay? Thank you for tuning in.